Hey everyone, and welcome to today's session. We're going to take a look today at exploring graphic styles and effects. So we'll be taking a look at the appearance panel, how to edit and apply some appearance attributes. We'll look at duplicating, disabling, removing some of those things, reordering all that. We'll also take a look at how to apply couple different effects and applying appearances as graphic styles, and then applying the graphic styles to an existing layer. So we're going to take a look at kind of a couple different ways. It's really more just bells and whistles stuff to kind of add in a little bit more to our animation. And then after the lesson, we're going to take a look at the first project, which is a custom icon, and I'll go into a little bit more depth about that. Everything is available for you underneath the weekly assignments folder. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, we're on the final lesson, which is lesson 13 that we'll be covering for the class. Click on that. Inside there is the lesson 13 start file. I downloaded it and expanded it, and it's just this L13 start. So I've got that thing open in Illustrator. After we're done with that, we're going to jump back into projects. That's going to be the second part of what we'll be doing in the class, and that's where we'll review this custom icon set. We'll come back to this after today's lesson. So this is what today's start file looks like, and the first thing I want to take a look at is making sure that I have my appearance panel open. I always want to make sure that I have that up and running, and I'm going to zoom in just a little bit, or I want to fill my screen with this so you guys can see a nice big bold version of this. All right, so what I'm going to do first is select my object. I'm going to start with this little cake stand piece on the bottom here, and what I want to do is I want to take a look at how those appearances are set and then what I can do to that. Now, my appearance panel, I really like working with this, and keep in mind that I've got some options here. I've got this add new stroke, add new fill. I can create a new effect. I can also delete pieces out of here. So say that like, I don't really want this stroke. So I could turn this off, I could set it to none, or I could just hit this delete button and it just gets rid of it altogether. Now I have this fill and the black doesn't work. I want the cake stand to match the bottom. So I'm gonna set it to this aqua color. And again, I'm just selecting a little drop down button here. So I can select that and it looks good. And I think what I want to do is I want to add in a little bit of texture. If you guys clicked, you might have noticed that there's some patterns that have been saved in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a new fill. And on that new fill, I'm going to select, let's try this one right here, the 6 LPI. And what it looks like is it's just kind of like a little line pattern that drops in there, gives us a little bit of a texture. Last thing I want to take a look at is this drop shadow, and I do not want this drop shadow on there. It just doesn't look right. It's kind of sitting flat against the background. That's not really how light works, so I want to get rid of that. So I can either uncheck this eyeball, or I can just delete this thing altogether by highlighting that particular piece in the appearance and hit the delete or trash can button. So that's how I'm going to kind of go through and get rid of these things. Now keep in mind too, I've got multiple fills here. So say that I turned off this one, the other still exists, or if I change my mind about my pattern, I can always turn it off from there. Now, what I want to take a look at next is playing around with this birthday bash text and kind of applying some things to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my text. And when I click on it, it shows me my characters. And if I double click on characters, it pops open this box. It's showing me my stroke, my fill, my opacity. I kind of want to do that same thing. What I want to do is I'm going to take this existing color, and I got this pink, and I think that works out all right. But what I want to do is I want to add in a new fill. So what I'm going to do is with this selected, again, double clicking characters, I've got my fill. And I'm not doing a whole lot with my appearance. Now, when I double click on my characters, I select it all. And if I want to change this, I can. If I want to add in a stroke, and I'm going to click away just to my regular selection tool. And in order to add multiples, what I can do here is just add in this new fill. And I'm going to add in a couple, and I'm going to apply this to everything. So for my fill, what I'll do is I'll set my background to this pink color. And then this foreground, I'm going to set to these little dots that I had pre-built here. Now, I don't like how opaque they are. I want this to be a little more subtle. So I'm going to click on this opacity, and I'm going to take this and I'm going to drag this backwards and kind of fade that back, maybe around 30% or so. I don't want it to be super strong. I just want to kind of knock it back so it's a little bit more kind of pushed to the background. Now, the other thing that I can do is I can apply a stroke to this thing. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I think I'm going to apply, I'll apply this orange to it. I think I'm just going to grab like this top right orange. 1 point should be fine for right now. And I can also take a look underneath my stroke. If I click on this, I can control my cap. So if I maybe want to round my corners or adjust my caps, if I want to kind of soften edges, I can do that just by clicking on this. And that's basically the same thing as going to window and down to stroke. And that'll pull up in that same kind of box. Again, you can also see that from up here. So there's lots of different ways to get to these things. The appearance panel is nice though because it keeps them all kind of captured all within one spot. So now I've got that on there. I think that looks good. And the next thing I want to take a look at is going into and applying some effects to things. So there's a couple of things that are pre-built in. There's like things called live effects. So say that I wanted to maybe put like a little shadow on something. The way I'll do that is with selecting this, I can do this a couple of ways. If I go to my effects menu, I've got all these different types of effects. Now, notice that they're broken down into two sections. I've got this Illustrator effects. This is really more about transforming the shape of an object. So distorting things, warping things. Photoshop effects work a little bit different. Photoshop effects are really going to be more like adding texture to your illustration. So it's really more of like a raster effect more than like a vector effect. But what I want to do is underneath stylize, I've got some pretty kind of common sounding ones. You probably recognize these if you play around in Photoshop. So say that I wanted to add like a drop shadow to this. Now, the issue that I'm going to run into is that my drop shadow, it's not applying to everything. It's just applying to that stroke. So I can kind of apply that drop shadow to different areas. So if I wanted to apply to the stroke, it's going to shade in inside there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deselect that. I'm going to apply that drop shadow to my fill. Now I can go back up to my effects menu and get that stylize command, or I can just use this little FX button right down here. So I'm going to grab that. I'm going to stylize. I'll throw in a drop shadow. And then it gives me some options. So this is kind of bold looking. I'm going to knock down this opacity. Maybe I'll set this to, let's try 40%. It's kind of also a little bit more thick here. So let's maybe go to like 0.07. It's a little bit more subtle. I bet I could even go down a little further. Let's like take this to 30. Less tends to be more when you're dealing with shadows, but again, it's just going to give me a little bit of depth on that text, and that's really the idea on it. Now, next thing I want to do is on this text, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a little bit of a warp effect to it. So I've got my type selected, and I'm going to grab everything here. I'll go down to Effects, Warp, and let's do an arc upper. See how that looks? And your default might be way up here. I don't want to overlap that 30 text. I just wanted to kind of touch the bottom just a little bit. So I'm going to do something real subtle, maybe like 7% or so, just to add a real slight curvature to it. Now, again, if I decide I want to change my mind on any of these things and make it look different, I can always go back in and I can turn things off. So say that I didn't want my drop shadow, I could turn it off. I also notice here my warp arc upper. If I click on this, say I wanted to change something, style, the amount, any of that, I can also change that right from this appearance panel. So none of these effects that I'm applying to this are permanent. They're all just things that I'm controlling within my appearance. So next thing we're going to take a look at is kind of playing around with this 30 text up here. We've got kind of like this three-dimensional look, and I want to make both of them look the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this 3. And with this thing selected, I'm seeing that I got like this yellow stroke. I've got a fill of white. I've got another fill of orange. So I got kind of a couple of things stacking up on here. And what I want to do is I want to get what's called an offset. Now, if you take a look at this thing, in that yellow stroke, I'm going to change this to pink. So I'll grab that pink. Now, it's pink, but what I want to do is I want to kind of like push this to the inside. I want to offset this path and push it in a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that little FX button. And if you take a look, I've got all my different options, and I've got one called path and then offset path. So I'll select that. And here it's going to push it way out. Now, if I put a negative in front of this thing, it's going to push it inside. But what I have to do is I have to tell it how far. This is way more than I want it to go. I'm going to have this set to go to like 0.03. And if I tab, it'll show me. Now, you can play around with these numbers if you want more or less, but that's just kind of the default that I'm going to be working with. And I like how that looks. I'm really happy with that. And then if I want to adjust anything else on this, backgrounds, maybe I don't like this fill, maybe I want to change some of the different options for it, I can do that. But I think I'm pretty good with how this looks so far. The only thing is I'm going to want to match this. So we'll get to that in just a second. What we're going to do before we get to that point, though, is take a look at those other types of effects. Now, we've seen some of these Illustrator ones like warping, stylizing, path, that kind of stuff. Down here in Photoshop effects, it's a little bit different. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag on these little flames up here, and I want to try and apply a Photoshop effect to them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Effect, and if I knew exactly what I was looking for, I could go right to it, or what I can do is I can click on Effect Gallery, and it's going to pop open a little preview of what all these things might look like. So I've got all these artistic ones, cutouts, different knife styles and watercolors. I got brush strokes that I can apply to this thing. So really it's a matter of just kind of going through and playing with whatever it is. And then also notice that there's sliders. So whenever I see these sliders, I like to kind of slide them all around, see how it's going to affect what it is I'm doing. The one I'm looking for is under texture. I'm going to apply some texture to this thing. And I'm going to click on this grain one. And what I want to do is I want to play with my intensity and my contrast of this. I want to play around with these sliders and see. Normally I slide them all the way to the left. I slide them all the way to the right. Just kind of see what it is that they're doing. So it looks like if I don't have too much going on there. I also see this drop down. So there's regular, crumpled, sprinkles. It's kind of different effects. So the one I'm going to look for here is I'm going to try this contrasty one, and I'm going to go somewhere in the middle with my intensity. I'll set this to around 50. And let's turn my contrast all the way up to 100. So it kind of gives me a little bit more of that effect. So I'll click OK. It applies it on there. And now notice it applies this as a group with this style to both objects. And it kind of gives me almost like this pixel art effect. Now, with this, if I needed to go back and change it, again, because this is an object and it has appearance to it, I can go back in and adjust that at any point. Now, got that taken care of. I feel like this table down here, like how it's sitting on this, I want a little depth to it. Now, rather than screwing around with all these additional effect settings, what I want to do is I'm going to go in and take a look at something called graphic styles. So if you go to your window menu, about halfway down, you'll see something called graphic styles. And in the graphic styles, it's basically where you can kind of preset objects. So what I want to do is, I don't really have a whole lot to work with here, but if I click on that little library icon at the bottom, there's all sorts of different ones that I can pull open. So what I'm going to go to window and then graphic styles. I'm going to try some 3D effects on this thing. So it's going to pop open a whole window, and it's got a bunch of pre-built 3D effects on here. And I like this purple, kind of like 3D effect 11 it's called. So I'm going to click on it, and that just automatically applies that 3D style right to it. And again, there's a whole bunch of this stuff that's just built right into Illustrator for you to use. So if you ever feel like you need to kind of put a little more pop on something, that's a real simple way of doing it. Now, what I want to do is I want to adjust something. I really like my 30 up here, but I want my 0 to look the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the object. I think I'm going to change this stroke to yellow. I think it'll look a little bit better with that flame. So I'm going to change my stroke. I'll grab this yellow color. I think that looks pretty good. I still like the orange, although maybe for this fill that's kind of repeating as like a color in the background, maybe let's go to this aqua and kind of blend out those colors a little bit more. And I really like how that's looking. So what I can do is I can actually save this as a graphic style. So here I've got this little icon. So when I click on it, it shows it. It's a path. It's got these effects set to it. I'm going to click and drag down into this graphic styles, and it doesn't really look like much. It's kind of real, like subtle looking. But if I click on this other object and select this, it's going to auto apply that exact style onto it. So the nice part about this is you can play around with it, tweak it, get it looking exactly how you want, and you don't have to redo this over and over again for every object. You just do it once, and it auto applies it right on there for you. Now, looking pretty good, feeling pretty happy with this stuff. I think one thing I want to do though is I want to play around with that birthday party text. I'd like to get a little bit more pop on that, kind of do like that 3D effect style as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to that text and select it. And I've already got a bunch of stuff going on here, but what I want to do is I'm going to select the stroke. So here's my orange stroke. And with this selected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my little effects button down here, and I'm going to go to this distort and transform. We haven't really messed with any of these. I'm going to try this transform option. And what I want to do is I want to move this a little bit. Now, it doesn't look like it's doing a whole lot. It's just scaling it, but it hasn't really moved. It's horizontal, vertical, it's at 100%, so that's not really changing. But if I move these a little bit, so let's maybe go with like something real subtle, like 0.1 and 0.1. That's probably a little bit too much, but maybe if we turn copies up, let's do 5 copies and hit tab. Now, that's a little bit too much space. Let's add another 0 in there, really kind of space those out. Now what it's doing is it's adding that 3D effect, so I'll click OK. But my problem is it's not sitting right. It's kind of on top of it. So if I grab my stroke and I slide it down to the bottom underneath my fill, now it's going to act like it's got that effect to it. Now my drop shadow here, take a look. It's overshadowing that background. Well, let's turn off that drop shadow or just delete it altogether. And let's turn on this one. So now this one's going to be applying back behind it, and that other drop shadow will kind of stack. So from top to bottom, that's how we're kind of seeing all the different pieces to this layer. Now maybe I wanted to add in another stroke, and maybe what I'm going to do is something like a stroke of white around the outer edge of this thing. I want to make sure I got the object selected first because that'll make it a lot easier. I can add that stroke of white, and now I got a nice big pop of contrast. Color looks good. I got a nice big blend to it. So I'm very happy with that. That's really what I'm looking for. All right, as far as the last thing I want to look at is just kind of scaling. So here, if I select this object, remember you've got this scaling button, And I always, when I use the scale tool, I always want to make sure that I'm scaling my strokes and my effects. If I don't have this checked, what happens is as I make this thing get bigger, it doesn't get any thicker. Now, what I want to do is, because that's checked, when I scale this up and kind of add into that, that stroke gets bigger and kind of complements right alongside it as well. So again, real simple way of working, but it's doing exactly what I want it to. It's giving me that kind of color, that kind of effect. If I wanted to add in anything else, I could maybe go in and select like these objects here. Maybe I'll add in an additional fill, and maybe I'll play around with adding in some more of those pieces with the pattern. Maybe I'll throw those on this. And then maybe on this middle one, I'll just go in and add one more, and I'll throw that over the top. And then if I want, I can always go back in and knock back my opacity and kind of control my appearance that way. If I select multiples and shift click, because they have the same properties, it'll grab both of them, and I can grab that appearance and knock them back as well. So that's it. When you're done with this thing, you're going to stop and save this thing as lastname-lesson13.pdf and email that over to me. And now that we have this taken care of, what I'd like to do is jump into the first actual project that we're going to be doing as far as a bigger scale piece. And we're going to be creating some icons for a video game infographic. So I have this as a start file, but what I want to do is jump back into Blackboard and kind of walk you through what this project's going to look like. I have a couple of good resources here for you. So you jump back into Blackboard, there is a couple things I want to look at. First thing is this custom icons PDF. If you click on that, it's going to pop open kind of a little walkthrough. For this project, what you're going to do is you're going to create 5 different video game related icons for an infographic project. Now, you're going to be creating an infographic. If you're not familiar with what that is, an infographic is something where you're going to be displaying data visually. So you want lots of little kind of simple, easy to read icons that might relate to your subject. You guys will be able to do this on any aspect of the video game industry. So if maybe it's a specific game you play, maybe you don't play games at all. Maybe you just want to kind of look at like, well, what were the 5 games that made the most money in the App Store last year? That type of thing. So it can be on any aspect of the video game industry, but what I want you to do is create icons that might relate to that. So that infographic is going to be the next project. You're going to be building some pieces for it. So I'm going to ask you to think ahead a little bit as far as what your subject's going to be, and then build some icons for it. So some people have done this very generally. Some people have got very specific down to one game or one specific thing that they do. Now, things you want to think about when you're building icons is simple, simple, simple. When you look at an icon, it should immediately translate what that is trying to say. So icon subjects are things like controllers or consoles, characters, devices, accessories, display items. Maybe it's like retro stuff. But again, you're going to be creating 5 of these icons, and you're going to be creating them on 5 different artboards at 1 inch by 1 inch. And then you're going to save and submit these things onto both via email and then onto a Google Drive folder, which I have ready to go for you guys as well. Now, before we get into that, I have this really great walkthrough. It's icon design in 6 easy steps. I really think that this is an incredible article as far as process and simplicity. So if you take a look, there's 3 things you really want to think about. What is the structure? What is the form of the icon? Is it circular, triangular, organic, horizontal, vertical? Characters, what are the character styles? Is there square, corners, or rounded? Are the line weights all the same? Is the color palette consistent? And then the identity is really just kind of giving something a little bit of a twist so that they all seem cohesive and unified. Now, as far as building your icons, you generally like to start with a square grid. Sizing isn't going to matter that much because of how we're building these in Illustrator, but I do want you to think about kind of starting with a square. Then thinking about how your layout's going to look, because you want your icons to have a similar visual weight. Are they going to be horizontal, vertical? And if they're horizontal and vertical, how are they going to kind of blend off to each other? Next thing is start with real simple shapes. You always want to work geometrically. Circles, ovals, triangles, squares. If you're working with angles, you want to make sure your angles are all complementary or similar, 15 degrees, 45 degrees, 90 degrees. And then if you're working with curves, you want to make sure that your curves have nice, even, smooth rounding to everything. Because icons are small, they should read real small, like something tiny on your desktop, or should be able to be blown up really big and still deliver that same message just as effectively. So again, if you're looking at corners, consistency with your corners, balance to them. When it comes to line weights, you want complementary line weights on everything. So here, thicknesses of this to this, pixel widths. So you want to think about, if you're using a 4-point line, keep that across all 5 icons. You want that kind of consistency. Another thing too, so like with this design set, they use this little notch. They kind of found a way to cook this into under the tires, by their hip, by the top of the calendar. But again, use details, use decoration, use that stuff really sparingly. You just want to kind of keep some nice, consistent visual unity and then maintain some uniqueness to it. So that's really the idea. Simple, simple, simple. So if you're looking at kind of how this is redesigned as a walkthrough for this, and again, I'd highly recommend sitting down and actually reading the whole article. The original to get redesigned, how much more simple it is, how much more fast it works, and how much more consistent it is. So if I jump in Illustrator, that's really the idea with mine. I wanted to kind of maintain similar line weights, the thicknesses between my objects, the thicknesses of the larger portions, like the wrap here to the top of the controller. So here I'm going to do mine about more general stuff, like so I've got like a trophy icon. I've got something for online gaming, something for online competitive stuff. Maybe I'm going to talk about specific like accessories. Maybe I'm also going to talk about specific systems. So I've kind of built some basic ones. You can design these in black and white. You'll apply color to them once you get into the actual infographic project. And I have all that information available for you. So what you're going to do is design your 5 that you think might apply best to whatever topic it is you're going to work on. You'll save and email those over to me. And then you'll also drop these inside this icon SharePoint. So if you click on this, it's going to pop you into a Google Drive folder that everyone has access to. This has just been my students over the last few semesters have been saving stuff in here. You'll see there's older things in there. If you feel free to go through this stuff, take a look at it. And if there's anything you want to actually use in your projects, think about this as just one big SharePoint. So that's where you're going to want to drop everything into. So if you have any questions about building your icons, what you're looking for, what you might have an idea or a couple of you might want a little bit of help narrowing it down, that's totally fine. Just reach out to me. And then once you're wrapped up with your icons, you're going to jump over into the next lesson, which is on infographics. I got a little walkthrough on what that looks like, what they are, how you'll submit them, and when they'll be due. So if you got any questions, again, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, have a good time designing. Thanks, guys.